It was a cold autumn morning. Washington lay quiet beneath a blanket of gray clouds, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Leaves had turned yellow and fallen, and the wind moved with a kind of sorrow, carrying traces of the past. In the heart of the city, at the historic plaza, a crowd had gathered, waiting but not just for a ceremony. Today was meant to honor war veterans, yet people sensed something more. A reckoning was coming. In the center of the plaza stood a podium, one that had witnessed countless speeches over the decades. But this morning, the voice that would rise through the wind and silence wouldn't be just another political address. It would be the echo of something much deeper, a voice born from hurt, from betrayal. Among the crowd stood a man whose presence drew quiet attention. His silver hair swayed in the breeze. Kevin Harrow, a former Marine. He'd fought in Iraq, lost brothers in battle, and came back to a country that had, over time, forgotten him. The wounds inside him didn't show, but every step, every glance, carried the weight of an unspoken story. He walked silently among the other veterans, his eyes scanning the American flags around the square. To him, each star was a memory, each red stripe a symbol of blood lost. In his hands, he held a folded flag, not just a symbol, but a vow, a dream, and a deep disappointment. Harrow stopped a few steps from the stage, his eyes locked on the podium. No one had spoken yet, but the plaza was already heavy with echoes of the past. He couldn't hold back the thoughts racing through his mind. The hope he had when he went to war, the reality he faced when he returned. They were oceans apart. That gap had hollowed something inside him, year by year. Just then, Trump entered the plaza. His stride was firm, confident. His face bore the wear of years, but his expression was familiar. He'd met thousands, spoken to millions. But for a brief second, as his eyes met Harrow's, he paused. There was something different in that gaze, a shadow of confrontation. Trump glanced toward Harrow's side of the crowd before stepping up to the podium. The people cheered, but Harrow remained still, because inside him, a storm was building, and that storm wasn't going to be silent much longer. The ceremony began. The national anthem played. Officials delivered their speeches, but everyone was waiting for one moment, the moment the president would take the mic. And finally, Trump stood before them. Applause rang out. Trump began his speech, but Harrow couldn't hold it in anymore. He stepped forward, cutting through the crowd. Security noticed and began to move, but something in Harrow's face stopped them. This man wasn't a threat. He was truth about to erupt. And then in the stillness of the plaza, his voice rang out. "I fought for you, Mr. President. We fought for you. But when we came home, you forgot us." Silence. Trump froze. The crowd did too. Time stood still. Only Harrow's words echoed in the air. That voice wasn't just speaking to Trump. It was speaking to a nation. The voice of the forgotten. The scream of silent pain finally breaking through. Trump stood frozen at the podium. This wasn't a routine performance. Harrow's eyes carried years of pain, and Trump saw it. His words had pierced through the crowd, sinking deep into everyone's chest. Harrow kept walking forward, clutching the flag tight to his chest. His voice trembled, but his steps didn't falter. Security hesitated, unsure, but Trump lifted his hand, signaling them to stand down. As Harrow's words filled the plaza, all eyes locked onto him. People weren't just hearing a man speak. They were being forced to confront something within themselves. This wasn't the voice of one veteran. It was the voice of thousands. Then Harrow stopped. His eyes locked with Trump's. "I fought for you," he said again, this time softer, more personal. "For your country, for your words, for your people. But you didn't hear us." A hush fell over the crowd. A few began to cry in silence. Some recorded the moment on their phones. Others couldn't look away. Behind Harrow, other veterans bowed their heads, trying to hide their tears. Trump took a single step forward. He slowly lowered the microphone, and for the first time there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Something raw, vulnerable. This wasn't the stage of a political leader anymore. This was a moment inside the storm of a man's soul. "We owe you," Trump said, his voice low but steady. "This country owes you, and men like you. And personally, I'm honored to know someone like you fought for this nation." Harrow reached into his coat with trembling hands and pulled out a folded letter. "This is from my son," he said. "He died in Afghanistan. He fought for you too, but he never came home. All we got back was silence." Trump took the letter. For several seconds, he read it silently. Then he closed his eyes and drew a deep breath. "Your son," he said, "is one of this country's heroes, and I share your pain." The entire plaza fell into silence. It was as if time had stopped, as if no one dared to breathe. Trump pressed the letter against his chest and stepped forward. He reached out his hand. Harrow paused, then took it. The handshake was more than just two men meeting. It was a moment that touched the soul of a nation. The video went viral within hours. The hashtag #Harrow moment spread across social media. People shared it, commented, cried. It went beyond politics. It was something human. The next day, newspapers ran headlines like, "A veteran's cry, humanity won at the White House. Trump responds with tears. A window opened into the nation's heart." After the ceremony, Trump met with Harrow privately. He awarded him an honor medal at the White House, and Harrow's story began to echo across the country because his courage broke the silence of others. News channels covered the moment for days. Psychologists, historians, politicians, everyone talked about its impact. But more importantly, letters poured in from all across the nation. People wrote to Harrow, thanked him, made sure he knew he wasn't alone. Harrow was no longer just a veteran. He had become a symbol of justice, of remembrance, of reckoning. And Trump? He said he'd change that day, that he'd shift his focus from politics to people. Criticism remained, but no one could forget what happened in that square. Because that day, one man opened his heart, another man listened, and a nation learned how to find a voice in the silence. What happened that morning in the plaza wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was the beginning of something deeper. Harrow's words echoed across America. For many families, they unearthed grief long buried in silence. And for the first time, that pain was being heard in the public sphere. The handshake between Trump and Harrow replayed on every major news channel, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. Each network analyzed the moment from a different angle, but all agreed on one thing. This wasn't just a political gesture. It was a call to the conscience of a nation, and that call didn't go unanswered. On social media, Harrow's name became a symbol. Thousands began sharing their own stories under the hashtag #Harrow. A mother wrote about losing her son in Iraq. Another veteran opened up about his emotions for the first time in years. People began to realize they weren't alone. Universities held panel discussions. Veterans spoke face-to-face with students. Young people began to understand the weight carried by those who came before them. A student from Georgetown wrote, "I've read stories of heroism in books, but Harrow's story showed me what true courage looks like." And Trump, a few weeks later, in a speech that caught many by surprise, he spoke about Harrow once more, this time without a teleprompter. He spoke from the heart. Politics, he said, requires listening to people's pain, and I'm still learning. Harrow reminded me not just of a hero, but of a father, of a human being. His words signaled an unexpected shift. Critics questioned his sincerity, but across the country, people were watching closely, because this wasn't just Trump's story anymore. It had become America's story. At night, silence spoke loudest in Harrow's home. As the world outside quieted with each passing hour, the whispers inside his mind grew louder. His son's room had remained untouched over the years. Books still lined the shelves, a half-finished model airplane sat on the desk, and a forgotten stuffed dog rested at the foot of the bed. Time hadn't dared to move anything. But what truly defied time was the emptiness inside Harrow's heart. That night, the night everything changed, his eyes fell on a wooden box tucked into the corner of the room, once used by his son to keep notes. When he opened it, a stack of old letters emerged. The envelopes had yellowed with age. Some had never been opened. With trembling hands, Harrow picked one up. In James's handwriting, it read, "Only open if I don't make it back." His eyes filled with tears. Slowly, he opened the letter. Each word struck like lightning. "Dad, maybe you'll never read this, but if you are, know I always loved you. Whenever I needed to be strong, I thought of you. I always wanted to be a man like you. You taught me how to hide my fear, how to keep walking even when it hurts. If I didn't make it back, please don't stop living. This world needs your light." Harrow clutched the letter to his chest. The tears wouldn't stop. This wasn't just a message from a son. It was a will, and that will set a new direction for Harrow's life. The very next day, he walked into the local Veterans Center with the letters in hand. He showed them to the officials and said, "These aren't just mine. Across this country, there are parents waiting on letters from sons and daughters who will never come home. Their voices deserve to be heard too." From that moment, Harrow launched a project called Echoes of the Heart. Through it, letters from fallen soldiers were collected, digitized, and shared with the public, sometimes even turned into documentary films. These weren't just memories, they were the emotional map of a generation. One letter shook Harrow to his core. A young lieutenant had written to his mother, "Mom, even with gunfire all around me, I can still smell your soup. At night, I close my eyes and picture us sitting at the kitchen table. Maybe I won't make it back, but know that in everything you're with me. And if you ever meet someone named Harrow, thank him, because I fight with hope because of him." Harrow sat in silence for hours after reading that. Then he found that soldier's family. He went to their home and handed them a framed copy of the original letter. The mother wept and embraced him. "You gave him back to me," she whispered. "I never thought of it this way, but now it feels like he's here again." Over time, the project grew. Universities began studying the letters as literary texts. High schools incorporated them into curriculum. Students were no longer reading about war. They were feeling it. They were touching loss, understanding hope. At a national conference, someone asked Harrow how he managed to read through such painful words. He took the microphone, closed his eyes, and said just one sentence. "Because in every line I hear my son, and it doesn't feel like I lost him. It feels like we're still talking." Echoes of the Heart became the most powerful initiative under Harrow's foundation. Every year on July 4th, families across the country gathered to read the letters of their fallen loved ones. They shared stories. They held hands in silence. And in many cities, instead of classical music, public loudspeakers played voices reading those letters aloud. Even the Trump administration took notice. They created a special fund for the project, and a presidential advisory board gave Harrow the honorary title of chair. At a White House meeting, Harrow stood at the podium and said, "Sometimes a single sentence carries more truth than 1,000 speeches. Healing this nation won't come just from laws, it'll come from words." Everyone in the room stood and applauded, but inside Harrow was still holding on to one sentence. "If I didn't make it back, please don't stop living." And now life hadn't stopped. It had begun again, worth those very words. Though Harrow spent months in silence after losing his son, a spark was slowly growing inside him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a yearning to keep the memory of the fallen alive and to carry their names with honor. Each lonely morning and every sleepless night, Harrow found himself talking, not out loud but on paper. Pen met page. He poured his soul into words. And one morning he began writing the letter, the one to Trump. It wasn't short. It was a story. From James's childhood, to their camping trips, to the day he left for the military, every detail was there. But the heart of the letter rested in a single sentence. I fought for you. Now what will you do for my son? When the letter reached Washington, it exploded across social media. Veterans, mothers, teachers, students, thousands joined Harrow's voice. They all began asking the same question. They fought for us. What are we doing for them? And then something no one expected happened. A formal invitation arrived from the White House. President Trump wanted to meet him. Harrow thought about it for days. He didn't know what the meeting would mean, what it could change. But in the end, he made his decision. He would go for his son's honor. On the day of the meeting, Harrow's heart pounded in his chest. When he stepped into the Oval Office, it felt like he was facing his past. Trump stood up to greet him. Harrow reached out his hand, paused briefly, and said, I fought for you. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Trump remained silent for a moment. Then, looking directly into Harrow's eyes, he gave a reply the public would never hear, but one that shook the room. And now I'm committed to rebuilding this country through the sacrifice of men like you. Those words didn't just move Harrow, they moved a nation. Following the meeting, the White House announced a new support program for veterans. But Harrow had something bigger in mind. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a call. The beginning of a movement born from silence. He founded a nonprofit in his son's name, the James Harrow Foundation. It offered psychological counseling, scholarships, and legal support to families of fallen soldiers. In a matter of months, it gained national recognition. Partnerships were formed with universities and nonprofits. The foundation's first campaign was called Be Silent for Them. Every year, on the anniversary of James's death, a nationwide moment of silence was held. That silence became something powerful. Thousands across the country would bow their heads, eyes filled with tears, not just remembering loss, but feeling unity. TV specials, documentaries, books. Harrow was no longer just a father. He had become the voice for those who had none. And with every speech, he ended the same way. My son went silent, but I turned his silence into a scream, because sometimes silence roars louder than the loudest cries. And so Harrow's grief became a movement, and that movement now echoed, quietly but powerfully, in the hearts of millions. After that historic meeting in the Oval Office, Harrow's life was never the same again. He would later call that day the moment when a man carrying the weight of loss awakened the conscience of a nation. The words spoken behind those closed doors weren't just a promise. They were a turning point. Trump's response didn't leave a wound in Harrow's heart. It lit a fire. He was no longer just a grieving father. He had become a voice, a representative. That day, he didn't just carry his son's story. He carried the stories of thousands of soldiers and their families. The first thing Harrow did after leaving the presidential office was expand the structure of his foundation. Helping wasn't enough anymore. Real change was needed, systemic change. He began holding meetings with civil society leaders, state officials, and community organizers. In every city, every town, he was determined to plant seeds of hope. The foundation's evolving mission was no longer just to mourn, but to heal and build. Harrow launched rehabilitation centers for soldiers and families affected by post-war trauma. These centers offered more than therapy. There were art workshops, educational programs, and career support services, places of true transformation. What became known as the James Harrow Legacy grew into something more than a cause. It became a civic duty. It was taught in schools, discussed in universities, And then one day, Harrow was invited to speak before the United States Congress. That speech would be marked as a day of history. Standing before lawmakers, Harrow declared, "I lost my son, but I've etched his name, his memory, his sacrifice into the future of this nation. Today, I do not stand alone. I speak for every family who's ever stood at a graveside. If we truly wish to honor them, we cannot abandon what they left behind." The chamber rose to its feet, a standing ovation. But it wasn't just for Harrow. It was for every silent hero his voice carried with it. Soon after, the Military Family Support Act passed through Congress with unanimous approval. It became the first federal law to guarantee lifelong support for families of fallen or severely traumatized soldiers. The media called Harrow the living symbol of the American spirit. His voice was no longer a single cry. It had become the echo of millions. And yet, every morning, Harrow whispered the same words to himself. "I'm not just a father, I'm the echo of my son. I'm a calling that rose out of silence." And that calling, it was being heard across every corner of America. The passing of the Harrow Act wasn't just a legal reform. It was the moment when a quiet shift in the heart of a nation was finally put into writing. It marked the beginning of a new era, where the forgotten were seen and the silent were finally heard. Ceremonies were held across the country to commemorate the law. One of them took place in Harrow's small hometown. The town square looked different that day. Old school friends, neighbors, former teachers, they were all there. And this time, Harrow didn't speak as a hero, he spoke as a messenger. "This law is a letter written in my son's memory, but it must also speak for your sons, your brothers, your husbands." The crowd listened in tears. For the first time, a piece of legislation felt less like words on paper and more like hope etched onto people's hearts. Television networks broadcast his speech live. Across the nation, families watched in silence as his soft but resolute voice echoed through their homes on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Harrow's words reached millions. Young people saw him as an inspiration. The elderly sent prayers, but Harrow didn't stop there. "This is just the beginning," he said. With the newly established Harrow Foundation, he launched a campaign to build rehabilitation centers for veterans across the country. In every city, centers bearing Harrow's name began to open, places where former soldiers received both physical and emotional support. On every wall of those centers, one sentence was painted: "Silence should never be a necessity, it should be a choice." And that wasn't the end of it. Harrow quickly became an international symbol. He was cited as a role model during NATO conferences. European countries launched similar initiatives for their own veterans. A park was named after him in Canada. A university in Japan awarded him an honorary doctorate. But despite all this, Harrow remained humble, and he kept repeating the same line: "I am not a symbol, I'm just a father who lost his voice, and I will never be silent again." During one of his university speeches, a young soldier stood up in the audience. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I came home from the battlefield, but my soul is still there. My family doesn't understand me. My friends feel like strangers. But hearing you speak, for the first time, I feel understood." Harrow walked down from the podium without a word. He embraced the young man, and the room fell completely silent. Because sometimes the most powerful words are the ones never spoken. One morning, Harrow stood at his son's grave. In his hands, he held the first printed copy of the Harrow Act, and he whispered softly, "Look, son, this is for you. We're not silent anymore." That's how a new beginning was written. Harrow no longer carried silence as an enemy. He carried it like an old friend. Each morning as the sun rose, it was as if his son's voice echoed through the light. But those echoes no longer pierced his heart. They wrapped around it instead, like a gentle, aching comfort. Over time, that silence became his strongest storyteller. Where words fell short, silence shouted. One day, an unsealed envelope landed in Harrow's mailbox. No return address, no sender's name, just a single sentence. Sometimes what we lost long ago can only be found in silence. Inside was a handwritten note from one of James's old comrades. He had fought beside James during his final deployment. The soldier chose to remain anonymous, but his words carved deep into Harrow's soul. James wasn't fearless, but he was the bravest among us, because he moved forward despite his fear. At night, he'd tell us stories his father once told him. He didn't talk about the battlefield. He talked about the man who raised him. And I found myself longing to meet that man more than I feared the enemy. Now I need to speak to him, because to me, the war isn't over. Those words led Harrow to a turning point. From the echoes of his heart, a new idea was born. A project that would center not on words, but on silence itself. He called it Beyond the Silence. No letters, no speeches, only glances, still moments, tears, pauses. The first event took place at Arlington National Cemetery. Hundreds of families walked in complete silence, holding photos of their loved ones. At the front was Harrow, carrying a portrait of James. Members of the Trump administration nodded, but in that space, there were no parties, no politics, just people in silence. At the end, Harrow stepped toward the microphone. No one expected him to speak, and for a long time he didn't. But finally he said, "No one spoke here today, but I heard every one of you." That single line echoed across national media. It became a symbol of how silence could hold a nation's shared memory without saying a word. Soon, artists joined the movement. Musicians, theater actors, dancers. Each began to express the unspeakable through wordless performances. A young woman who had lost her brother on the front lines took the stage. Her only action was to gently let a coat fall to the ground. The entire audience broke into tears. A university professor published a thesis titled "Silence in Collective Grief." And in the final line she wrote, "Silence does not echo trauma, it holds it," and Harrow transformed that silence into a movement. As for Harrow, he spent those days once again sitting in his son's old room. And in the quiet, he heard an echo, like James whispering, "Dad, I never left. I just became the silence." And Harrow closed his eyes and smiled, because silence was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a way of coming home.